church home in Indianapolis, Indiana, First Congregational United Church of Christ. We have been serving God together for 161 years, and I am the first woman senior pastor of the church. Praise God! I bring greetings from the national setting of the United Church of Christ, from our General Minister and President, Reverend John Dorhauer, and the national staff, where I am honored to serve as your minister for disabilities and mental health justice. This is a new ministry that is an outgrowth of the work that is being done by our United Church of Christ Disabilities Ministry Board and the United Church of Christ Mental Health Network. Because the work you are doing is so powerful, we have dedicated this role to come alongside you and to work with you. So I am here to learn from you and to hear from you as we create this new position together. And so one of the questions on my heart is, what is justice for mental health? What is justice for disabilities? And so I invite you to engage with me in that conversation of what does justice look like? And as I begin on this journey, I can't help but think of Jesus and how Jesus manifested justice as he welcomed all into beloved community. And so it's that radical inclusion and community building, which is what we are doing here right now. And so I want to take a moment to thank the planning team who has made today possible. If you are serving on the planning team, would you please raise your hand or rise so we can thank you? If you are serving on the Mental Health Network, will you please raise your hand or rise so we can thank you? We have very humble leaders in the Mental Health Network, but I do want to take a moment to thank Reverend Alan Johnson, who has been a pioneer in this movement of becoming a WISE denomination, the first designation of its kind in the country. And so because of his visionary leadership and the work that his local church did in Boulder, Colorado, that's really where this movement was born. This WISE movement came from that local church. And so thank you for your faithfulness, your perseverance, and your dedication. Thank you, Alan. And Reverend Amy Petrie-Hill is also here, and I want to acknowledge that she is the first person in the United Church of Christ ordained to a mental health ministry position in her local church. So congratulations. And we are here because of the Spirit calling us to be part of this movement. And so that's what I want to invite you to get a sense of today, how God is calling you to be part of the movement of God for mental health justice, for mental wellness. And to reflect on your life and your story. What is at the heart of this for you? Where does mental health touch you in your deepest core? Because I think as we do this ministry, we are ministered to. If we open ourselves to how God is calling us to be on this journey together. Coming back to California, it feels like home. I was born in Whittier, a suburb of Los Angeles. And so as I come back here, I smell the smells of home. And Bishop Lund said, "Welcome home," and I gave her a hug, and I said, "Yes, I am home." And as I heard her talk about the people who is served by City of Refuge, I heard her talk about the people who make their homes on the streets, and how this congregation has a heart for people who are living on the streets. And we know that about 40% of people who are living on the streets have a mental health challenge. And one of the tragedies of the way that our brains can be impacted by disease or illness or disorders is there's a symptom called anosognosia, which about 40% of people with schizophrenia have. And it doesn't allow them the self-insight to know that they are unwell. And so oftentimes they do not take medications, they will not seek out treatment, care, and support. And so many times the people who are living on the streets have this type of diagnosis and this reality. And I can share that with you because that was my father. And back in the 80s, when he was living on the streets, we didn't know what we know today about the brain. And so we thought he was a very stubborn man who didn't love us enough to get help. And we were so mad and angry with him that we punished him by alienation and isolation. He became that bad guy that we didn't know how to help. He didn't want to help himself. And so in the family, it caused so much disruption and disorder and chaos. But thank God there were churches like City of Refuge who could see in my dad a child of God, worthy of a family, the family that we could not be, the church became. Yes. And so there are people longing for community, longing for family, longing for what the church, by our very DNA, was created to provide. And so I share this with you because my father died in an indigent care facility, homeless, and far away from all of us in the family. And we were so afraid that he would die an unloved person. But when we got the shoe box of his remains, in it was a wallet with $20 that my siblings got pizza and had a pizza in honor of our dad. That was our inheritance. And in that box was a certificate of First Communion, because a church had seen in my father a child of God who was worthy to be at the table. Even though we were afraid of him, because one of his symptoms was hypomania, and he was a big man, he was 6'3", he came to see my brother when he had his new child. Somehow he would just show up everywhere, anytime. He would just show up at your house. We don't know how he got there. He had no money, but he would show up. So he showed up at my brother's house. He wanted to meet his new grandson. And so there's a story of them sitting in the living room, at the dining room table, my sister-in-law holding the new baby, and my dad talking and talking and talking, and the chair he is sitting in crashes to the ground. And he continues talking. He is so excited to be there with his new grandson, and he is unaware of his surroundings. But he was trying to love us the best way he knew how. And as a family, we didn't know how to love him back. We barely were able to let him into our lives. And so I am thankful that the church was able to love him back the way he needed to be loved back. So when I think about justice, I think about love and how the church showed up to love my dad when we could not. And I don't think it was our fault as a family. We did the best we could. We did the best we knew how. And so I thank God for churches like City of Refuge, and maybe your church, who finds a way to expand your definition of family to include people like my dad, who had severe and chronic mental illness, who had anosognosia, who wasn't able to comply with treatment. It was just who he was. And the church accepted him just as he was. I think that's justice. I also think justice is a church that will say, I will stand with you when you have to testify in court about whether or not you have a sound mind, like my brother did. My brother was in and out of psychiatric hospitals his whole adult life. He was in and out of college, a full ride. He was in and out of graduate school, a PhD in biochemistry. He was in and out of being a college professor. He went up and down the aisle and got married. He was able to do all these things, and still he had severe and chronic bipolar disorder. And so for him, life was 7 times an hour, every hour of the day, thinking about ways to die. Not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted the pain to stop. This pain in his brain that was a physical pain. It's a real pain. And so time with him was sometimes him sharing ways that he imagined he could die. And so as his sister, I was alongside to keep him alive. But I wasn't alone. The church was there with him. The church was there when he went to his pastor and said, "You know, Pastor, I have bipolar disorder. And what helps me is this bipolar disorder support group. Will you advertise this support group in the church bulletin?" And the pastor said, "Yes, that's important. We will make space in our church for this type of support." To me, that is what justice looks like. It is saying you belong here and that you matter to us, and we will make space for you here. Growing up, my father's illness really became quite severe when I was a young girl back in the 80s, back before we talked about mental health, right? And so as a kid growing up in California, moving to Missouri because my father's illness was a threat to our safety, all I knew was that this was crazy. And my mom was trying to keep us alive. And so we began to flee for safety. And my mother's instructions to all 5 of us children, we were under the age of 15, was to don't tell anyone because we have to get out of here alive. And if your dad finds out, we may not make it. So as a little girl at 8 years old, I had to keep it a secret. And that stayed with me. But what do secrets do when we internalize them? What do they do to our bodies and to our minds? Secrets plant seeds, and not the good kind. So I had those secret seeds stirring in my stomach, so that as a little girl, I would have chronic stomach pains. My mom would take me to the doctor, and they would say, "We don't see anything wrong." We fled to my mother's parents' house, and the next day we got a phone call from my dad. He was heartbroken that his family was getting torn apart, and my mom was trying to keep us alive. So her whole theory was that we get away, he gets help, and then we get back together. But what do you know from what I've shared with you about my dad, about that hope of reunification? The hope of him getting better. And so that long summer became fall. And so we enrolled in school in this new town, in this new place. And my mom had $0. We had been saving. My dad was an animal doctor and had saved, everyone had a college account. And in my dad's hypomania, what happened to that money? It was gone. So we went from a middle-class lifestyle to a poverty. We registered for food stamps. We got our clothes at Salvation Army. And this is another area of mental health justice, because oftentimes these untreated, undiagnosed illnesses impact our ability to work and to have an income. And that too was a shameful reality and is part of the stigma of mental illness. My mom did her best, and she was just trying to help us survive. But going into that school system with my father who was homeless, having no income, we would have been homeless unless my grandparents had not provided a house for us. We were living in a home my grandparents rented on our behalf. So this severe chronic mental illness rendered a woman and her 5 children homeless. Was that my mom's fault? Was she lazy because she was on welfare? No. And that is a justice issue. Getting through school, we kept on waiting for my dad to get better. I don't know, we were waiting for a miracle. And so the years went by, and his illness continued to spiral, getting worse and worse. He would call and talk on the phone for hours, sharing hallucinations. And somehow that was the love language. Just hearing his voice and knowing he was thinking of me was enough. We were churchgoers that whole time. Yet we were so ashamed and embarrassed, we never let the church in on what our family was going through. We kept it quiet, we kept it to ourselves. It was one of those secret seeds stirring in my stomach. So that when I became a middle school student, 7th hour was math. I'll never forget it. A student came and gave a note to the teacher, and they called my name up and said, "Your dad is here to pick you up, take you home early." I was terrified. I went to the office of the school, and there he was. He just shows up. You never know when he's going to show up. He had been living on the streets. He was driving a dilapidated truck, and there he was to spend time with his youngest daughter. So I look at the office administrator, and she says, "Go with your father." And I went with him, and it was the longest car ride of my life. I asked him to take me home. I had a paper route to do, and I was scared. And he dropped me off at the house and disappeared. Not too much longer then, my brother Scott, who was the eldest son, he started having manifestations of his own mental illness. You see, in my family, it runs in the blood. But thank God my brother's form of bipolar did not have anosognosia. And so he was able to get treatment and help. But his psychotic episode happened while he was at school. We all had to have jobs. We were poor. We had babysitting, bussing tables, paper routes. He cashed all his savings account in $1 bills and handed out money at school. He had shoe polish he had painted his body with. He was out of his mind. And who did they call? My grandparents came and picked him up. But that night, I'll never forget him screaming in the kitchen and my mom not knowing what to do and calling 911 for help. And the police show up. Now this is before we had crisis intervention teams, which thank God we have police officers now trained to respond with compassion and appropriately to someone in a mental health crisis. That is justice. Amen. That is justice. But back then we didn't have that. So when the police arrived, they tackled my brother to the floor, handcuffing him and putting him in the back of a police car. That is injustice. He was not breaking any laws. He was having a psychotic break. And so he went to the hospital right before Christmas. And when we went to Christmas Eve worship, my mom and her 4 children, the 5th one was missing. People would comment to my mother, "Where is Scott?" And what do you think my mother said? "He's at home." We could not feel we could even say the words in church. And those secret seeds continue to grow. Thankfully, my brother was given medications, and he began what will be a new way of life for him, of therapy. Thank God he discovered sobriety through the 12 steps. And that keeps him alive, because all of his attempts at suicide and engaging in suicidal activity happen when he is not sober. And so I am thankful for churches that open their doors for 12-step groups. You are keeping people alive. And that is justice too. Those sacred circles, that is justice. That is how the church can show compassion and mercy and include people in God's beloved community. Thank God my brother got the support he needed, was able to go to school, get married. I went to school too. I went to seminary. I went to social work school. I had to figure out what was going on in my life and why was my father the way he was. And so the first time I learned about mental illness was when I was in college. And I started to realize that my father's inability to love me was not because I was unlovable. It was part of his disorder that interfered with our bonding and our relationships. And that's mercy. And that brought me so much healing, to know that it wasn't because I was this unlovable child, but I had a father who had a severe mental health challenge. And it was not his fault. And it was not my fault. And so part of my journey with Jesus went to a whole new level because I was allowed to ask God to forgive me for hating my father, to forgive me for abandoning my father when he needed us. I begged for mercy, and I asked from God to give me compassion and give me a heart of love. Show me how to love my father, who is so unwell that he doesn't know how to love us the way we need to be loved. My brother, Scott, had been targeted by my dad, and there was abuse that happened, my father abusing my brother, Scott. But part of Scott's healing journey was also to forgive our father. He led the way. He would reach out to our dad and say, "Dad, we forgive you. You do not know what you do. We forgive you." Because that was part of my brother's healing, right? It's relational. My dad survived because of other people's compassion. He would meet people and they would say, "Well, you can live with us for a while." But then he would wear out his welcome. And so thank God there are centers and facilities that will house people that no one else will house. And that's where my dad ended up. When we were in high school, my father's sister, they had their own kind of disruption of their family unity. When my cousin, my dad's nephew, after a whole childhood of acting out, of being arrested for minor crimes, in and out of juvenile detention centers, my cousin had been abused as a child. And so he developed addictions and acted out of his woundedness. When I was in high school, we got a call that my cousin Paul had been arrested for murder. And we were shocked. We had just seen him the week before. He had been arrested for indecent exposure. He had come to our house wanting gas money so he could drive back home to the farm. We gave him the $20, and later that night, he harmed and murdered a woman in his farm community. The record shows that after the murder, he then assisted a young woman who had a flat tire that same night. And his mind was not in a good place. So there was no doubt that he committed this murder. Yet when we had the trial for him, they made a case that this is a person who was abused from birth. My aunt had adopted him from a family that had harmed him. He was in a body cast at the age of 2. And throughout his childhood, he demonstrated all of these signs of illness and mental health challenges that were never treated. He never got the help he needed. Guess when the first time was when he got medication for mental illness? Guess when that was? On death row. That is not justice. That the way that most people in our society get the mental health care they need is in our prisons, our jails, and on death row. But this murder in our family and this death sentence just got added to those seeds. I was carrying a lot of these secret seeds inside of me, these shameful seeds. I was a Christian, and I wanted to be a pastor and a minister, and no way was death row or severe and chronic mental part of the image of church that I knew. I didn't know anyone at church who had a family member on death row or a family member who was homeless. At least we didn't talk about it. And so the secrecy followed me all the way through seminary. My cousin and I were writing letters while he was on death row. He would encourage me, and I would encourage him. Mostly him encouraging me. Because on death row, there was a chaplain who visited him. He chose to be in solitary confinement because he was victimized by the other death row inmates. And it was safer for him to be in isolation. But the chaplain was the one person he felt safe to be with. Thank God for our chaplains who go to death rows, who go to prisons, who go to the psychiatric wards. We need more. The church needs to send more people out there into the streets, to the hospitals and the prisons. My cousin sent me that letter I never wanted to get. It was the letter with his execution date. And he asked me to witness his execution. He asked me to be his spiritual advisor. This was my finals week at Princeton Seminary. I was about to graduate, literally finals week, when he was to be executed. How many people had I told at my seminary about my cousin on death row? None. So I went to our dean of students and I said, I know you don't know this about me. You need to know that this is part of who I am. This is part of my story. I'm being asked to go to death row. I'm trying to be a Christian minister, and here I'm being invited to death row. But I have to take my finals. So what would Jesus do? So I asked the dean, what should I do? The dean, and what do you think the dean said? Go. That is holy ground. And I was so angry. I didn't want to go. Are you kidding me? I was nice and comfortable at Princeton Seminary. It was easy to keep secrets there. Nobody knew. I was going to confront one of the most evil places in our country, where we kill people who are sick. We are murdering people who have severe and chronic mental illness, who have low IQs, who are poor, and people of color. That's who we murder. The state, with your money, is doing this. And that is where I was called. Where was God? Where was God for my cousin Paul? All he wanted was chocolate cake for his last meal. That's all he wanted. They didn't have it. But the nurse who had been caring for him for 10 years brought him some pills to help him feel better. That's what we do. We drug him up, and then we kill him. And we do it at night, at midnight, when nobody's awake. And we do it out in the rural parts of this country, where nobody can get to. Not even the families who want to be there. So I watched as my 30-year-old cousin, with the IV in his arm, took his last breath. And I said, where is God?
Where is God?
And the prison guard said, ma'am, it's time to go. And I picked up my Bible, and I said, don't forget Paul. He is a child of God. Don't forget the people on death row, the people in our jails and prisons who are children of God. Who are there because we neglected to care for them. The church neglected to care for them.
Mercy.
Because we don't want to be like them. We don't want them to be a part of us. But guess what? I don't think I'm the only one with these secret seeds. And so as I struggled with where was God when my cousin was killed, seminary, on the steps of Miller Chapel were students and faculty singing, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" They had candles, and they were praying. And God was there. And that gives me hope that the church can be a witness and bear testimony to what is happening in death chambers around this country and around the world. I came back from that experience and I felt called to give a testimony, to share what had happened. I was so outraged that we could treat people this way. And so I gave a talk to the students, and faculty came and students came. And I'll never forget, after the talk, an international student came up to me and she said, "Oh my, Sarah, I can't believe the United States that goes around the world talking about human rights, that you would treat your own people this way. I can't believe it." And so, church, that is a justice issue that is very much at the heart of mental health justice. But I was ashamed. And it was so much easier to keep these secrets. So that as I became a pastor and trained for the ministry, we have to do these psychological evaluations. You know, we got to make sure that the clergy are not crazy, right? Right? How many clergy would we have left? I mean, come on. So through the screening process, a lot of us are smart. And we're smarter than the test. So I did all these testings, and it was 2 days of testing. I met with the counselor to go over the results. And I'm a little nervous because I think crazy runs in the blood, and I have some myself. So when we meet to go over the results, first thing this man says to me is, "Sarah, do you have a boyfriend?" Okay. So I say, "No, why do you ask?" He said, "Well, I have a son your age." So who has some mental health challenges here in this situation? Boundary training, my friend, boundary training. And so the next thing he said, he reviews my results, and he looks at him, and he looks at me, and he says, "Sarah, you have lived a charmed life." Because that's what we do, don't we? Yes. Especially in the church. We wear that mask, and we keep those secrets, and we carry those seeds of secrets everywhere we go. And what does that do to the body of Christ? It harms it. It is harmful. And as I was being a pastor to my people, I realized I was not letting them know who I was. So I was not letting them love me. And I was not allowing myself to love them because I had this barrier, this mask on. I was a divided self. I thought I had to be someone in order to be a preacher of the gospel. I didn't think I could be my whole self. And it really hit home when I got the call that my father was dead. 6 months after my wedding, he died. But guess who showed up at my wedding? My dad. And I was terrified. We all were afraid. I had asked my brother Scott to walk me down the aisle. I had it all planned out. He would never have children. His wife had divorced him. He didn't want children because of the severe chronic mental illness. He was afraid that it would pass on to the next generation. So when my brother found out that our dad was there, he said, "Sarah, I cannot do it. I cannot walk you. I am so sorry. I cannot walk you down that aisle. I am afraid." So I did not know what to do. And for a bride, it's kind of a big deal. How are you going to get down the aisle? I knew I could walk down by myself, but I wanted someone with me. So I slept on it, I prayed on it, and I woke up with the answer. I would invite all 3 brothers to walk me down the aisle. And we would feel safe, and we would feel protected and together. So my favorite photo from the wedding is me in the middle and my 3 brothers alongside of us. But I'll never forget when we took the big family photos at the wedding, and they're so choreographed. We got the big family picture, everybody in the family in the photo with the bride, right? Everyone in the family? Everyone? Everyone. Except my father sat in the back pew, staring up at the ceiling. And I froze. I thought, wait, he's there. At the reception, I had not talked to him yet my whole wedding day. And at the reception, we were taking our leave, and I went to go talk to my father, who had showed up at my wedding. And I went close to him to give him a hug, and he said, "No, Sarah." He covered his mouth, and he said, "Stay back away from me. I am sick, and I don't want to get you sick. But I love you, and I'm proud of you." And that was the last I ever saw or heard from him. So when he died in that indigent care facility because of good people who said, "You are not trash. You are a child of God. You deserve dignity. You deserve care, even on your deathbed." And I told my church, I was a pastor at the time, I said, I'm sorry, I can't preach on Sunday. I got to go to my dad's funeral. In fact, I've been asked to help lead the funeral. I don't know what I'm going to say. And they were shocked. My church was shocked that someone as young as myself at the time, I was 30, would have a father die. Because they had no idea that my father lived with chronic, severe mental health challenges that caused his whole body to deteriorate. I had never told them. I was afraid for them to know. And so, as good Christian people, they showered me with beautiful Hallmark cards. And there were these pictures of little girls and their fathers, and that big hand holding the little hand. And I felt so angry because they didn't know, because I didn't tell them. A week after my dad's funeral, I went to a conference, and Anna Carter Florence was the preacher, and she said, "You know what? You all have stories to tell that the church needs to hear. That there are stories about you and God that the church needs to hear that we have kept silent for too long." And when she said that, those seeds of secrets, they started to grow. And they wanted to come out. And so I realized that God was calling me to break the silence that I thought I had to keep to stay alive. But I realized the silence was killing me. And that too is justice. Breaking the silence, naming the things we think we cannot name, and acknowledging the realities that we think are too hard to acknowledge. The church can be the place for people to share their stories, to share how God is working through our lives, even the hardest, most painful parts of the life. And so this book, Blessed Are the Crazy, was born from those seeds of secrets. It was the first time I'd ever told anyone. I don't know that I recommend publishing a book with all of your secrets, but somehow God took that mess and said, "I'm going to do something with it." Because we don't have to be perfect. We can be our whole selves. We can show up just as we are. And so I thank God for the church, who is making space for these conversations of how to be truly welcoming, truly inclusive, and supportive and engaged for people with mental health challenges, including myself, who I realize had post-traumatic stress, especially from my childhood, and witnessing that execution really changed me. And so I have a great therapist who is walking alongside me on this journey. I have a wonderful church that realizes that pastors need Sabbath. They need a day off of no emails and no phone calls. Yes. A pastor needs sabbatical. We need to be able to go away for 3 months at a time to renew our spirits. And some churches are even putting in their contracts for their clergy a mental health day, 1 day a month, not a day off. not vacation, but a mental health day that we expect you to do. We're going to hold you accountable, and we're going to give you some funding so that on your mental health day you can really do something to care for your mental wellness. And so, church, I'm excited to be on this journey with you because I believe that God is with us as we discover together how God is desiring for all of us to experience the radical love of Jesus Christ and the healing that is possible when we name things out loud, when we acknowledge our realities, and we can say that God is here and that everyone belongs in the family of God. Everyone is worthy. Everyone is made in the image of God. Thank you for being here today. Open your hearts today. Share your stories today. And know that God will bless you. Thank you so much.